The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 13. Irene Rose glanced across the breakfast table at her husband. He looked washed out, his face a grey shade of pale, his normal cheerful disposition seemingly vanquished. Michael had hardly strung two words together since he'd appeared at Mary's kitchen with Albert and the three Andrews children the day before, and then only when prodded. The trade union organiser was simply worn out, having spent the night wrestling with demons. Widow Weed's callous behaviour to a woman so obviously in desperate need of comfort and aid had haunted him throughout the night. Her shrill cry, "Take her away immediately! We pay our poor rates so as not to be pestered by beggars. You should be ashamed of yourself making her come out to prey on charitable people, offending good Christian gentlefolk to bring you money for spirits," continued to torment him. Michael's family, back home in Ireland, were Presbyterians, although the people of the community they lived in were mainly Catholics. As a result, most of Michael's childhood friends were also of the latter persuasion. Michael had never been particularly religious. He found the basic tenets of the teachings of Jesus, the son of a carpenter, a working man, attractive and essentially a force for good, but he remained basically indifferent to organised religion. He certainly agreed that one should treat others as one would like to be treated oneself. He lamented the fact that Christians in positions of power didn't practice this basic edict. He believed the churches were a source of division in a world already replete with conflict. Widow Weeds obviously regarded herself as a Christian, and no doubt, unlike Michael, she was a regular churchgoer. On the face of it, from what he knew of the teachings of the Bible and those of his parents, Christians should automatically side with the poor. Surely there could be no teachings in the Holy Book to justify an economic system that on the one hand amassed great fortunes for the few and drove the majority who laboured to produce that wealth into abject poverty, degradation, and a situation where death by starvation was all too often taken for granted. Michael believed if Christians and their organised churches had placed themselves at the head of the workers' movement and followed their carpenters' ethos, the Charter would have been won long ago, a democratic system of government established, and the conditions afflicting the people ameliorated, if not vanquished. Instead, the churches demonised those who took a progressive stand, denounced them as infidels, and prosecuted them for blasphemous sedition. Christians were a real and potent force in the land, the Church of England an economic and political power, as well as a spiritual one. Its estimated annual income in 1842 amounted to some £9 million sterling. Its bishops were paid sums of money many a European prince envied, and they wielded real political power through their seats in the House of Lords. Such was their influence, they could make and break governments. Amongst the dissenters and nonconformists, the Wesleyans enjoyed large-scale representation in the Commons. They were particularly strong within the Tory party, despite the fact that at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution they'd been the church of the labouring man, a position they'd long abandoned, resorting to pie-in-the-sky when you die sermons. By the 1840s, their governing bodies were composed of Tories to a man. Michael couldn't escape the reality of harsh historical experience. Organised religion had turned its back on the labouring poor, placing the narrow, selfish material interests and privileges of its own hierarchies above the teachings of the carpenter's son they paid lip service to. He knew there were individual clergymen of all denominations who defied the religious authorities, stood by their beliefs and sought to put them into practice. The Reverend James Schofield, whose chapel hosted the National Chartist Convention, was one, as was the Reverend J.R. Stevens. The latter had addressed the great meeting on Kersal Moor back in 1838 and seconded the resolution in favour of universal male suffrage. There were many more within and around the Chartist movement, a number in leading positions, but they'd all been denounced by the various churches they belonged to, Anglican and Dissenter alike. Many set up Chartist churches in response. Stevens, like Osler, a Tory by political instinct and a Christian by religious persuasion, had thrown himself into the struggles for the Factory Acts and the 10-Hour Bill, against the use of child labour, the new Poor Law and the workhouses, for publicly funded education, church reform and the separation of church and state. Like Osler, his brand of Toryism considered the welfare of the people the most important issue facing society, and his Christian beliefs insisted the rich and powerful had a God-given duty to protect the poor, to alleviate their distress, and attack and vanquish its causes. As time went by, his anger and frustration at the stand taken by the churches of all denominations led him to excess and the use of inflammatory language. Renowned for his sermons inspired by the God of battles, he often urged the poor to resort to violent methods, inciting them to resort to sabotage and even armed struggle. Following the first great meeting for the Charter in September 1838, his arrest soon followed. On December the 27th, he faced 3 separate charges of attending illegal meetings, using seditious language and blasphemy. Sentenced in August the next year to 18 months in prison, he said, unashamedly committing the sin of pride, "Thus I had the honour of being the first man on whom the government sought to wreak the vengeance of the law for participation in the Chartist movement." He severed himself from the Chartists following his release from prison, but devoted the rest of his active life to social work and the cause of the labouring poor. Whilst Michael knew instinctively working people would make little progress without using forceful means, such as civil disobedience and strike action, he had always rejected violent methods, viewing them as counterproductive. Now he was seriously taking stock and having second thoughts. When he and Albert had entered the cellar, housing the Andrews family, the sight that met his eyes and the stench that afflicted his senses had been truly shocking. Jimmy Andrews, a man who provided him with shelter when he'd first come to Manchester as a young man, lay on a truckle bed, a corpse, his skin blackened and putrid, his lips swollen, clothed in rags still wet through with the typhus fever that had taken his life. 3 children, 2 yet babes in arms, played on the damp, filthy floor, seemingly unaware of their father's demise, and still not knowing they'd never see their mother again. Every wall of the cellar dwelling was riddled with damp and black with mildew. Vile-smelling, germ-laden moisture seeped through the walls from the excrement-loaded drains outside. Michael had known Jimmy Andrews as a proud, hard-working, and, ironically, as a church-going man. Yet he and his beautiful wife, a woman who starved herself to death to feed her children and nurse her man, had been reduced to this by a dehumanizing economic system. The children both parents must have loved dearly, for they had given them bread when they had none, were now destitute orphans, facing a future worse than slavery. And Michael knew with a certainty that was absolute, widow weeds and her ilk, those who falsely professed to be charitable Christian gentlefolk, simply couldn't give a damn. He knew they represented middle-class opinion, and that of established religion. Anger and disgust filled his mind. A thirst for revenge remorselessly ate away at his long-held commitment to peaceful methods as a means of redress. What was it the Reverend Stevens had once said? "You have no need to fear the power of government, the soldiers, bayonets and cannon that are at the disposal of your oppressors. You have a weapon that is far mightier than all these, a weapon against which bayonets and cannon are powerless, and a child of 10 years can wield it. You have only to take a couple of matches and a bundle of straw dipped in pitch, and I will see what the government and its hundreds of thousands of soldiers will do against this one weapon if it is used boldly." It would be so easy. Michael had access to virtually every mill in town. He was known to every man and woman on the committees for public health and safety, and trusted by each. Every mill was packed full of highly combustible materials: raw cotton, cotton dust, lint, yarn, or finished cloth, with oil-soaked cotton waste coating the machines and floors. His imagination ran riot. He could see the night sky throughout and all around the town, bright red with purging fire, the flames leaping ever higher, destroying the means by and through which the masters accumulated their wealth and exercised their demonic, dehumanizing dictatorship. He could feel the purifying heat of the fiery furnace in his head, knowing once the flames died down, the oppressors would have nothing save ashes, broken bricks, and twisted metal. Then they'd realize what it was to be reduced to the same position as their hounds, the only capital at their disposal, their own labour power. Perhaps that might put an end to their hypocritical preaching that the poor shall inherit the earth, if only they'd hold their tongues, be obedient, and wait patiently for death to open the gates of paradise. A shrill, determined voice assailed him. "Michael, you have to snap out of this. We've children to look after." Irene Rose's frustrated, angry exclamation interrupted his thoughts. He looked at her, brought back to reality, shaking his head at his own vengeful ideas, the words of the atheist Shelley in his head admonishing him. "And at length when ye complain, with a murmur weak and vain, 'tis to see the tyrant's crew ride over your wives and you. Blood is on the grass like dew. Then it is to feel revenge, fiercely thirsting to exchange blood for blood and wrong for wrong. Do not thus when ye are strong." In the West Riding, events were moving at great speed. General Brotherton arrived in the walled town of Leeds that Thursday to take overall command, with some 1,200 troops at his disposal. A temporary barracks was made of the White Cloth Hall. The town remained relatively quiet. Coal miners had abandoned work at the Middleton and Hunslet pits. The 38 prisoners taken the previous day appeared before the magistrates. 27 were imprisoned whilst awaiting trial in York, fixed for the 3rd of September. In Manchester, Salford and the neighbouring mill towns, peace and quiet prevailed, the workers very much in control, patiently awaiting the outcome of the Chartist Convention, although on the streets there were obvious signs panic was beginning to get the better of the bourgeoisie. Troops and cavalry processed along the major thoroughfares, horse-drawn artillery pieces much in evidence. If they intended to cow the workers into submission, or draw them into violent action, it wasn't working. The mills remained closed, and workers showed no great desire to risk their lives by needlessly throwing themselves against bayonets or bullets. O'Connor still remained convinced the whole situation was an anti-Corn Law League plot to discredit the Chartist movement, although he too remained quiet, deploying his employee William Hill, the influential editor of the Northern Star, to carry out his dirty work. Peter Murray McDowell addressed the convention on behalf of the Executive Committee, urging all present to adopt the resolution already carried at numerous meetings and by the Conference of Trades delegates, arguing all labour should cease until the People's Charter became law of the land. William Hill led the opposition against, but unfortunately for him the vast majority of those speaking didn't agree. Cooper supported McDowell and the executive, arguing he'd vote for the resolution. The spread of the strike would and must be followed by a general outbreak, he contended. The authorities of the land would try to quell it, but we must resist them. There was nothing now but a physical force struggle to be looked for. We must get the people out to fight, adding, if they were united, they must be irresistible. When it finally came to the vote, Fergus O'Connor emerged from his self-imposed isolation, finally casting his vote with the majority, having waited until he was absolutely sure which way the wind was blowing. In reality, the convention had little choice but to throw its weight behind the strike. As James Leach pointed out, failure to do so would have damned it in the eyes of the working class forevermore, and placed the Chartist movement in the same position as the Anti-Corn Law League. As soon as the news became public knowledge, the strike became national. Within days, turnouts were reported as far afield as Cornwall, Dorset, Somerset, Norwich and Peterborough, and throughout the manufacturing districts of Scotland and Wales. As Cooper had predicted, more troops were speedily brought into action. The Grenadier Guards mobilised, backed by the artillery, the 73rd Regiment and the 34th Regiment of Foot. Mass meetings of workers in London and other major centres were dispersed with naked military force. After the meeting, James Leach gathered the Manchester and local delegates together, impressing upon them the importance of remaining vigilant to avoid returning to their homes, sure that arrest warrants would be issued. The four who stayed at Matthew Ethero's the previous evening made their return journeys separately and to new safe houses, save for David, who returned to his wife and children at Matthew's by a circuitous route. Leach had secured accommodation with his old friend, John Doherty.